He has a PhD from MIT and he served as a professor at Purdue University and Indian Institute of Science here. He was also recognized as a technology pioneer by the World Economic Forum in 2006 and he has many other awards and laurels to his name. Today he will be talking about computational biology and vice versa. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Santosh.
When Prasanna asked me to come and speak and sort of organize a session in computational biology, and when I heard what the audience was going to be, I felt like I couldn't really engage you for 2.5 hours on my own, because these days what I do is run a company more than actually work in applied math. But so what I did was convince a couple of colleagues who actually still do that, the real nitty-gritty of the work, to come and give you, some of the details of the challenges both on the computational side and on the interpretation side. So, and both are computational challenges. One deals perhaps more with numbers and strings, and the other more with text and cognition and ontologies and so on. So so what I'll do is I'll basically set up the context and then let them actually give you some details. But in the process, I do want to mention certain things which excite me about this space. And if I was to start a research project in computational biology, this is where I would go, right? I actually gave a talk with this title 10 years ago in NIAS, at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, and the reason they were interested in it was because there was sort of a history of science aspect to this theme which I was talking about. This slide actually is a modification of an old slide that we used to use 10-12 years ago, when a bunch of us actually built the Simputer, which was a handheld computer. And what we found was that everybody was talking about IT, but nobody had actually built a computer. And so we said, if you don't build a computer, how can you claim that you have domesticated this technology? And how can you claim that you are now in an information economy and so on, right? So we said, domestication of computing, for that you need to build a computer from scratch, right? And that was the Simputer project. But then from information economy we have gone to bioeconomy. From bioeconomy we'll go on to a nanotech economy and so on, right? And for each of these steps you will need to domesticate technology, and and that will include both hardware and software, and coming to terms with all of that. And I think we are doing reasonably well on the bio stuff, and the real challenge will be to move it to the nano space. And I'll give a specific example that is starting to be exciting. So this is the history slide, right? So the history of modern biology, or what you might call molecular biology, roughly starts around the 40s and 50s, right? And of course the celebrated event is discovery of the double helix structure in 1953, and then of course various developments along the way. But the next big landmark is probably the idea of recombinant technology, where people realized that you could take DNA, cut pieces and swap things around, and actually genetic engineering, right? And this was how the company Genentech was born, right? Herb Boyer at UCSF and Paul Berg at Stanford and so on, and all of these people were experimenting with this stuff. Then you get the start of the sequencing technology to actually be able to sequence the ACGT code of DNA. In between here, of course, the genetic code itself has been worked out. People like Sidney Brenner and Khorana and others have been working hard at solving the genetic code, and then again from Sanger sequencing onwards, the next big sort of technology landmark is the declaration of the Human Genome Project, which in some ways only an American government can do, right? To commit $2.7 billion to actually either put man on the moon or sequence the human genome and things like that, right? So it took 13 years and $2.7 billion. And the spin-off from that was started to be felt around 2006, and with what is now called next generation sequencing, or NGS. And the effect after 2006 is enormous, right? And I think that's really the story that at least my two colleagues will certainly talk about, is sort of the effects that we see there. And of course, these are just some of the names of people involved. Now, one of the recent papers, which is supposed to be kind of a 10-year review of what the impact of the Human Genome Project has had, Eric Lander of the Broad Institute basically said, we must learn to program cells with the same facility with which we program computers. Okay, now that's a pretty loaded statement, and so some of what I will mention is perhaps trying to address this advice from Eric. Now, the history of science project that I outlined at NIAS 10 years ago was that if you overlay this history of modern biology with the history of computer science, there's actually a very interesting, interleaving of the two histories. Well, first of all, I think the time period is roughly the same. I mean, you can go back to Leibniz and so on, but really, strictly speaking, Turing and von Neumann are working in the 40s and 50s, and you start building machines here. And in fact, the first Indian machine, TIFRAC, was built in 1960, 61, I think. The story is that Homi Bhabha had spent time at Princeton with von Neumann and actually got all the von Neumann's papers and notes and so on, and brought it back to TFR Bombay and just put it on the table and told Narasimhan and others, come on, build this. Right. So, and I'll back you, I'll fund you, and so on. So they just got together and built a computer. And that was one of these big vacuum tube machines, of course, in at that period. But it was quite remarkable that it was done so soon, right, given the resources that were available and so on in India in those days. And of course, here we have the real blossoming of computer science. I mean, you have programming languages, various things going on. In some ways, quite a little bit like the recombinant technologies that are happening, the restriction enzymes, all the pieces and coming together, and then something very different happens here, and this is where the vice versa comes, right? That is, Edelman. By the way, this is it's misspelled, but Edelman is the same Edelman of RSA, right? The number theorist, or theoretical computer scientist, and Edelman at some point hung up his boots in computer science and kind of said, I'll actually go to a lab and start working in biology, and went to University of Southern California, and there has led a group that has done fairly remarkable things. So in 1994, Edelman announced that he had captured the Hamiltonian path problem in biology, and actually essentially exhibited a computer in a test tube, right? And so that began this whole process of thinking about biological computing. Right? Now, along the way, several things have happened. I think the thing that made the biggest splash was probably Venter's work on synthetic life, and where he claimed that he had created synthetic cells using by introducing some phages in some E. coli and cells, or not exactly sure what the structure was, but this was sort of the arrival of synthetic biology in some sense to everyone's attention. But then there's also been a lot of progress on this biocomputer fundamentals. So what Edelman did really can be thought of as storage. He worked out the storage for a computer. I think then somebody had to work out communications by using signaling in biology to actually work out computations, the analog of computation. And then finally somebody had to work out how to build logic circuits, because so being able to implement and or and all the logic functions biologically would then complete the basic building blocks for a biocomputer. That last piece was done about a month ago, right, by a group in Stanford led by Drew Endy. So we are actually at a stage now where we can build biocomputers. So I'll give you just a glimpse of that. I think this really, to get into that, it would almost be a semester-long course at least. But just give you a quick glimpse. So again, yeah, I think we've already talked about this. So you have molecular biology breakthroughs becoming technology, being sort of implemented in technologies. And then the technology inflection that happened around 2005, 2006 in genomics, where this new generation sequencing technologies come. And then the synthetic biology stream starting. These would be, I would call these the big milestones in biotechnology. Now, why do we call this an inflection point in genome sequencing? By the way, this is a log linear scale, so the white line is Moore's law, right? So if you think Moore's law has had a dramatic effect on your life, to the point where my this is obviously much more powerful than the IBM 360 that I learned how to program on, right? So that's the effect of Moore's law, right? Look at what's happening with genome sequencing. Okay? It's almost another exponential of Moore's law. So what took $2.7 billion to sequence the first human genome. Today, just to get the raw sequence out will be somewhere between $2,500 and $3,000, Vamsi. I think that's about what it's offered at by most commercial labs. I mean, we're not even. So from 2.7 billion to, let's say, 2,700, right? So how many zeros is that? Right? It's pretty staggering, right? And this is not ended yet. The expectation is that this can go to about $100. So for 5,000 rupees, you can get your entire DNA sequence. And this will happen, you know, it may not happen in 2 years as people think, it may happen in 5 years, you know, but it's within the realm of definitely what we and our children will experience, right? So naturally, when technology is getting cheaper and faster and so on, data is growing very fast as well, right? So when people in business, you know, talk about big data and all that, you know, it's almost laughable compared to the kind of big data that you see here. This is really, I mean, for example, just Broad Institute alone, which is one lab connected with MIT, was generating about 3 petabytes of data maybe in 2010. In 2012, they were generating about close to 16 or so petabytes of data, right? So the amount of data being generated by these instruments, and see again, you know, in biology you're doing multiple large sample studies, you know, and quite often you have to do it in many stages. So let's see. So the data explosion is such that data is doubling at about roughly about 5 to 6 months. So it's going even faster than Moore's law, much faster than Moore's law. So in some sense, you have to be smart, right? The machine is not going to solve the problem for you. You have to be smart about how you tackle problems. So let me just take about 5 minutes to give you a glimpse of what this biocomputer business is about, and then maybe we'll move on to more interesting mathematical topics, right? Oops. So basically, I think this we already talked about. You know, 1994, Edelman solves the 7-point Hamiltonian path problem using DNA, and I'm sure, you know, IIIT was probably not around then, but in most academic institutions, somebody gave a talk on how this was done, right? It was using, I remember my colleagues Vinay and others, and we all gave a talk at IISc about this because everyone was curious about what this meant and so on. And the DNA biocomputer has now reached a stage where you know, there's actually a programming language. It's actually called DSD, DNA strand displacement, and people are starting to build like visualization tools for programming in this language and writing in this language and so on. Oh yeah, so this is a Microsoft Research Visual DSD tool. It's basically using DNA as the basic material to build these biological computers. It doesn't have to be DNA. You could be working with other material, but DNA turns out to be quite useful. it relies on hybridization. Hybridization is, remember, the DNA is the double helix structure. So hybridization is the energy that allow the two strands to bind together, right? So that's basically the matching of the ACGT letters to the pairing of those, right? And today you're actually getting results, as I mentioned, on the Boolean logic world. And what's very fascinating is that you're also being able to model dynamical systems. And in fact, my teacher in all of this is an electrical engineer who used to be on the faculty at IIT Bombay. His name is Vishwesh Kulkarni. And Vishwesh, has visited Strand a few times. He works with Cass and others on modeling. And Vishwesh is right now in Minnesota, and so he's very much on the cutting edge of these things, and he's actually the one who's got the breakthroughs on dynamical systems. And people are now working on minimalist sort of ways of generating models. They're able to get linear systems using sort of 3 basic chemical reactions, but the binding rates make these computations really slow, right? And so it's not like these machines are going to replace semiconductors, right away. But there are other applications of this, and I'll try to address one of them. But you can speed it up a little bit using various enzymes and metabolites and so on, as maybe like chaperones to kind of speed things up. So again, this is the pairing up that causes the hybridization. So your DNA has the ACGT code, the nucleic acids, and so A and T sort of bind, G and C bind, so you get the hybridization. Just some general things: the human genome is about 2 meters long if you stretch it out, and 2 nanometers thick. There's about 3 billion pairs, so it's totally about 6 billion letters. And if you try to store it on a computer, it would be roughly about 750 MB. And when you hear Shanmugh speak, you'll actually see that actually storing a single DNA, the data that comes out of a single DNA sequencing run is more than that, but that's because you have to do multiple copies, right? So it goes into the gigabytes, hundreds of gigabytes at some point. And the human body has about 10 trillion cells. So as I mentioned, I think the DNA circuits take hours for such computations, and these are some of the new results on gates and so on. So the most recent result is on the XOR gates, which Drew Endy and others have built. Winfrey is at Caltech, so Caltech is another hotspot for this kind of work. Right? So early DNA computing is in the 90s to 2005, computation using DNA hybridization, and so the realization now is that DNA cannot beat silicon in the near future, certainly the speeds that we are seeing. And really that, when the Hamiltonian path problem was handled by Edelman, the question was, is this going to make NP hard problems easy to solve? And that doesn't seem to be the case. But what is really interesting is that you can actually put these computers now into your body, right? Or into living systems or into environments. So one of the most fascinating solutions I've heard to the energy crisis, to the environmental crisis and so on, is that you'll actually have fermentation plants in the ocean which will generate biofuels using nutrients from the ocean, and at the same time taking care of the carbon dioxide which is now dissolved in the ocean. And the controller for this entire factory will be a biocomputer that will be actually in the ocean, right? So at one go you're solving the energy crisis, you're solving the CO2 emission crisis, and you're so you know the excitement is around this. Of course, this is probably 20 years away. You know, it's not around the corner, but it's not a bad time to start in academia, right? To think about these things. So the revised goal is in situ sensing, actuation, nano devices, so on, which we could build. So you know, this is basically the analogies to computing. You have high-level you know, program directives, then there are compilers that will convert these into abstract chemical reactions, and then actually into biomolecular reactions, which then get fed into labs, right? And so, as I mentioned, the Visual DSD is the state-of-the-art compiler 2 plus programming language stuff. Right? I'll skip through this. Why can we manage everything with DNA is one question that people have asked, and so far it seems that you can, and people are able to make amazing structures with DNA, right? And if you, one of the best people in India working on this is a young professor at NCBS called Yamini Krishnan, I think, right? And of course there's also Mukund Thattai and the group who've been working on various BioBricks initiatives and so on. So also at NCBS, and IISc now has a big nano center, so hopefully they will also attract people who will be working on these things. And of course the applications, as I mentioned, fabrication, actuation, sensing, computation, right? So let me skip through that. There are basically a lot of operations and so on that and details that one has to go through, just like you would with when you are learning programming for the first time, you know, if you have to learn assembly code again, right? And so anyway, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that a lot of my learning in this biocomputer business has come from Vishwesh, and so with that I think the overview is done and we can move on, but I'll be happy to take questions.
Do we have the necessary mathematics to understand these synthetic biological systems in that something which is approximately like we understand engineering systems, like from whatever little I know, we are very far from such an understanding.
Yeah. How well do we understand weather? Right?
Well, okay, well,
Right.
engineering systems.
No, I agree. So, yeah, no, these will be challenges. I think these are challenges that engineers will do very well at, because, you know, I think, we are practical. We'll build approximations, we'll build, start off with some models and then, refine the models as we go along.
But so far, I think, I don't know,
Right.
please correct me, they have been trying to build simulation models of even trivial biological systems for decades.
Right.
But as of now, the progress has been, for predictive simulative models, has been very, very limited.
Right. Well, I think it depends. If you start out with an anthropomorphic kind of perspective, that you want to build something that simulates a cell, or even, you can start with a cell and say, can you build a virtual cell? And that's been a disaster, right? I mean, people have made some progress. The SBML language came out of that, the Systems Biology Markup Language. I was actually involved in one of the early projects that DARPA funded, and Strand built some of the early editors and so on for NYU and SRI and others to use. So if you start with a very open-ended design spec or application, the chances are you'll fail, just because of the complexity that you're referring to. I think where people are succeeding is if you start with a clinical endpoint or a specific question that you're trying to answer. And so at Strand, for example, now for about 7 years, we've had a team of about 10 to 12 scientists work on modeling, building a simulation model of the liver. And it's actually at a point now where pharmaceutical companies are sending us compounds, lead compounds in drug discovery programs, to test and predict the toxicity that these compounds might generate in the liver before they actually go into man and clinical tests and so on. And furthermore, our model can actually give insights into the mechanism that causes the toxicity. So it's not a statistical model, it's actually a physiological model which models all the biochemical pathways, the dynamics in those pathways. So it's about, I think, about somewhere between 200 and 300 differential equations that govern the dynamics, and then we simulate on those dynamics. And
that is exactly what I was trying to refer to. These 200, 300 differential equations.
Right.
Now the question is, how do you understand the parameter space?
Right. So the way these are hugely underdetermined systems, as you rightly point out. So and this is where engineering, I guess practicality has to come into play. So the way we approached it was that, we built it in little modules, and in each module we had a kind of a simulation goal, right? That we would try to show that we could replicate certain biological phenomena. And most of these were built around homeostasis. The liver and most biological systems are homeostatic, and so when you perturb them, they have to return to equilibrium. So the dynamics has to actually enforce that. And we also know the time constants involved in their return to equilibrium. So you use that to tune the parameters. Then once you
What if the system is unstable?
Oh right, if it's unstable, then then the liver is in problems, right? Right. So, no. So obviously, if it was unstable, then
You accept that it is stable and then proceed with it.
well, we are stable, right? We abuse our livers all the time, and our livers forgive us and come back to normal. We drink alcohol, we eat all kinds of fatty foods, fried foods, and ingest all kinds of chemicals, and the liver comes back to normal. So
Are there any books on
I mean, this is gastroenterology, right? About the liver itself?
modeling?
This modeling, no, we are published. We present papers, we publish.
There are no books on
We haven't written a book, we haven't published a book on it, but there's a bunch of papers that have come out of the group. These are typically presented at the Society of Toxicology meetings, which is kind of where all the people who understand toxicity of various organ systems come to. And so that was one thing. But actually, you're right. We actually got to a point where we said the virtual approach will not work, and that was when we wanted to study the effects of the chemistry of the drug okay, on the biology of the liver. Okay, so the model was of a normal liver.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay, but now you're saying you'll take a drug like paracetamol, right? Paracetamol is a terrible drug, by the way, right? For the liver, right? Acetaminophen is kind of very toxic in the liver, so you know the question is now when you ingest the drug metabolizes, and then the metabolites start interacting with the biology, right? So how will you predict all of that, right? And how do you even have a model of how it metabolizes, how it and that we said that's why we drew the line. We said we can't do this, but what we can do is do that experimentally, right? So we can actually take small quantities of the drug and give it to liver cells, feed it to liver cells, and then measure things that would happen to the liver cells, and those measurements we would plug into the model, right? So that's how. Now, in order to know what to measure and know what was critical and so on, we ran like millions of sensitivity analysis runs on the simulation model to figure out which are the sensitive parameters. Once you knew which are the sensitive parameters, you intersected those with these interactions of chemistry with biology and the various transporter rates and so on involved, and then the intersection turned out to be about, I think, close to 20 intersection points which were of interest, out of which we now know how to measure about 16, right? So the other 4 are still a challenge, but these 16 we actually measure experimentally, plug it in. So it's an in vitro, in silico model which is predicting like in vivo would. So so it's taken 7 years. It's taken 10 to 12 people 7 years. Now we've had to build a lab for this, and this is all for one organ. Now, if we want to do this, so there are other people working on the kidney. FDA has some internal models now. There's a heart model that has been built at Oxford, so there are people. There's a virtual brain project in Geneva, and by I forget his name, Henry something, Markham, right? And so there are about 6 or 7 such projects worldwide, and eventually maybe they'll all hook up and you'll get a virtual human, but right.
Do we have the mathematics? You
Yes.
take a system of 200 differential equations. Are you able to, yes, you find some interesting parameter regions. Are you in any position to, at this stage, to say, okay, forget mapping the whole space. Are there some catastrophic, non-obviously catastrophic regions where no drug should even attempt to go?
Well, that in effect was what we were doing, right? When we did the sensitivity analysis and we found parameters that were highly sensitive, we were really sort of trying to point out which were the ones that could lead to large swings, right? And those parameters we felt were very important to get right, because then the prediction quality would be higher. So and that's why those are actually measured using experimental setups rather than just guessed or right.
And I have one last question.
Sure.
Do you have any, at least the beginnings of a theory, how your model could spring from a microscopic model of the liver, from at least, let's say, a cell level model of the liver?
This is a cell level model.
This is a cell level model, and it's an aggregated cell level model.
Right.
Yeah,
I have one quick question.
Sure.
You said the cost of this genome sequencing has come down with
Right.
reference to that chart. What is the main reason for the cost to come down? Is it some kind of extra computing power that was available, or
No. I think it's real real engineering, not computing power. But where I think Moore's law and other things have come into play is there's a lot of robotics involved, a lot of optics involved, but then there's a lot of microfluidics. And then there's the chemistry itself. The chemistry itself is where the breakthroughs have come. So right, yeah. So it's but certainly I think there is a role there that Moore's law itself has played, but it's not the only effect. Right, sure.
Last question. You were talking about biological computers. They've been able to build some initial building blocks and stuff like that. Now, and the building blocks you mentioned were logic gates and or XOR and stuff like that, right? So why should the building blocks be the same as the silicon building blocks?
Right.
I suspect that if we start with the same building blocks, we're going to hit exactly the same bottlenecks, NP completeness and interactability and all that. So why should the building blocks be the same if you're trying to do computing in a completely different?
No, it's just to prove that you have a universal machine. That's all. Right. It doesn't mean that you have to use those gates. Yeah. This is a proof of universality, right? That's
the Hamiltonian solution and all that were there. They had nothing at all to do with these building blocks.
okay. Right.
Completely different way of framing
Completely.
solving the problem, which was
That.
equivalent in our standard.
Right, that's true. Yeah, it was a completely different setup. Once they moved to DNA as the basic building block, it had to be the whole Hamiltonian path setup was based on PCRs and yeah. So it was
Completely different.
Yeah.
I think this is just to say that if we can do all these building blocks, theoretically at least we can say that we can construct, we have a universal Turing machine. Okay, based on this.
Thank you, Professor
Sure,
Chandru,
thank
for
you.
the insightful. And as a little token of appreciation, I would request Professor Meenakshi to give a token.